The first suspects were questioned, but nothing seemed certain, and small inconsistencies began to surface. Tonight, hidden pasts and secret letters threatened to change everything in the investigation. Welcome to Unsolved Mystery Vault. I'm your moderator Falcon, Episode 3. Share your thoughts in the comments. Episode 3, Hidden Secrets.
The past has a way of returning.
The letters looked damning. Spread across the desk in Arthur Penberry's study, the blackmail notes seemed to point directly at the gardener, Thomas Reed. Each letter demanded money. Each hinted darkly at a secret from the past. And each bore the same uneven, slightly slanted handwriting. Inspector Finch tapped one of the pages thoughtfully. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, "it appears Mr. Reed had a rather compelling reason to see Mr. Penberry dead." Miss Marple did not immediately respond. Instead, she leaned slightly closer to the desk lamp and studied the handwriting again. Her gentle eyes narrowed. "Inspector," she said slowly, "have you noticed something rather curious about these letters?" Finch glanced at them again. "They're blackmail demands." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "But they're also rather theatrical." "Theatrical?" "Yes. The wording is quite dramatic. Your shame will be exposed, the truth will destroy you, and so on." Finch shrugged. "Blackmailers often enjoy a bit of drama." Miss Marple nodded politely. "Indeed they do. But this particular style feels familiar." She said nothing more. But inside her mind, something had begun to stir. Thomas Reed was brought into the study shortly afterward. The gardener looked nervous, though he tried to maintain a calm expression. Inspector Finch placed the letters in front of him. "Do you recognize these?" Thomas glanced down. For a moment his face went completely blank. Then he shook his head firmly. "No, sir. They were found in Mr. Penberry's desk. I've never written those." Inspector Finch folded his arms. "They're signed with your name." "That doesn't make them mine," Thomas replied quickly. His voice was tense now. "Someone's trying to frame me." Finch leaned closer. "And why would anyone want to do that?" Thomas hesitated. Miss Marple watched him carefully. People under pressure often revealed more than they intended. Finally Thomas said quietly, "Because I knew something about Mr. Penberry." Inspector Finch's eyes sharpened. "What sort of thing?" Thomas glanced toward the door, as if afraid someone might be listening. "Years ago," he said slowly, "before he came to Little Brackford, Mr. Penberry was involved in a terrible scandal." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly. "Go on." Thomas swallowed. "There was a business partner in London. A man named Edward Grant." Inspector Finch frowned. "And?" "He died." The room went very still. "How?" Finch asked. Thomas hesitated. "They said it was suicide." "But you don't believe that?" Thomas shook his head. "No, sir." Miss Marple's knitting needles, resting in her lap, clicked softly. "Why not?" she asked. Thomas looked uncomfortable. "Because I used to work for Mr. Grant." Inspector Finch straightened. "You worked for the man who died?" "Yes." "And you later came to work for Mr. Penberry?" Thomas nodded slowly. "I recognized him the moment he moved to Little Brackford." Finch's voice hardened. "So you blackmailed him?" "I didn't." Thomas insisted. "I swear it." Miss Marple studied him closely. And she believed him. Later that evening, Inspector Finch walked with Miss Marple through the manor garden. The moonlight shimmered faintly across the rose beds. "You think he's telling the truth?" Finch said. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. But the letters may not have been written by him at all." Finch sighed. That seems unlikely. Miss Marple stopped beside the fountain. Inspector, have you ever noticed how often people underestimate the power of imitation? Finch frowned. Imitation? Yes. Handwriting, for example, is not nearly as unique as most people imagine. Finch considered this. So you believe someone forged the letters? Possibly. And planted them in Penberry's desk? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, though that raises a rather interesting question. Which is? Who would benefit from making Thomas Reed look guilty? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, might lie in the past. The next morning, Inspector Finch arranged for a quiet search of Arthur Penberry's private papers. Miss Marple sat nearby while the inspector examined files and ledgers. Finally Finch discovered something interesting. A thick envelope hidden inside a locked drawer. He opened it carefully. Inside were several old newspaper clippings. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. The headlines were unmistakable. London businessman found dead. Police investigate financial scandal. Mystery surrounds death of Edward Grant. Inspector Finch read quickly. Grant's company collapsed, he murmured. Investors lost thousands. Miss Marple pointed to a paragraph halfway down the article. Read that part. Finch did. His business associate, Arthur Penberry, denied involvement in the financial irregularities. He looked up slowly. Good heavens. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Inspector Finch turned the page. Another article. This one included a photograph. Two men stood outside a London office building. One was clearly Arthur Penberry. The other man stood beside him, younger but unmistakably recognizable. Inspector Finch stared at the photograph. Miss Marple. Yes? That's Jonathan Blake. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes. I thought you might notice. The significance of the discovery was immediately clear. Jonathan Blake had not merely been Arthur Penberry's business partner in recent years. He had been involved in the original scandal decades earlier. The scandal connected to Edward Grant's death. Inspector Finch leaned back in his chair. So Blake had a very strong reason to silence Penberry. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Yes, though I suspect the situation may be slightly more complicated. How so? Well, she said gently, Mr. Blake appeared genuinely surprised when the body was discovered. Finch frowned. He also ran away. Quite true. Miss Marple resumed knitting. But people sometimes run when they fear suspicion, not necessarily guilt. Inspector Finch sighed. You're suggesting there's another layer to this. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. There almost always is. That afternoon brought another revelation. Margaret Dalloway requested to speak privately with Inspector Finch. She seemed pale but determined. There's something you should know, she said. Finch listened carefully. It's about my uncle's will. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. Oh. Margaret clasped her hands nervously. My uncle changed it last week. Changed it how? Finch asked. Margaret swallowed. He removed me entirely. The inspector blinked. You're certain? Yes. And who inherits the estate now? Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. Clara. The news spread quickly through the manor. Clara Penberry, it seemed, had become the sole heir to Arthur Penberry's considerable fortune. Inspector Finch immediately questioned her. Clara remained calm. Yes, she admitted. Arthur updated the will recently. Did Margaret know? I believe he planned to tell her soon. Miss Marple watched Clara carefully. The young widow's composure was impressive. Almost too impressive. Finch asked quietly. Did you encourage Mr. Penberry to change the will? Clara's smile was faint. Inspector, surely you're not suggesting. I'm suggesting nothing, Finch said evenly. But it does provide a motive. Clara's eyes hardened slightly. Arthur loved me. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. Love, she thought privately, had been known to motivate many crimes. That evening, Miss Marple wandered into the small writing room near the library. She was looking for something quite specific. The desk contained stationery used by guests. Ink, pens, and several sheets of practice writing paper. Miss Marple examined them carefully. Then she smiled. Because she had found what she suspected. A crumpled sheet in the wastebasket. Covered in repeated words. Thomas Reed. Written over and over again. Practicing the signature. Miss Marple folded the paper quietly. So someone had indeed forged the letters. But why? Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Miss Marple stepped out just as Inspector Finch approached. I've just received the coroner's preliminary report, Finch said. Oh? Yes. The poison used was aconite. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Monkshood. Finch looked surprised. You know it? Many gardeners do. Finch's eyes narrowed. Which brings us back to Thomas Reed. Miss Marple said nothing. Instead she handed Finch the crumpled practice sheet. The inspector read it. Then looked up sharply. Someone practiced forging Reed's name. Yes. Finch's voice grew quiet. So someone deliberately framed the gardener. Miss Marple nodded. But that's not the most interesting part. What is? Miss Marple pointed gently at the handwriting. Look carefully. Inspector Finch stared at it. Then his eyes widened. Good heavens. Because the handwriting on the practice sheet matched something else perfectly. A note written earlier that week. A note found in Arthur Penberry's personal diary. Written by only one person in the house. Clara Penberry. And as the truth began to shift beneath them, Inspector Finch realized something chilling. The investigation had been heading in the wrong direction all along. But before he could speak, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Followed by a terrified scream. Someone else inside Rosewood Manor had just discovered something. Something hidden. Something that could change everything.
This story didn't end years ago, did it?